On the morning of my 70th birthday, I stood barefoot in the kitchen, holding a warm sponge cake I'd baked the night before. Just like I used to when my daughter was small and would come running into the house with scraped knees and a hunger for something sweet. But that morning, the house was silent. No flowers, no knock at the door, only a text that read, "We're taking the kids to Disneyland this weekend. Hope you don't mind." Happy birthday, Ma. I'm Eleanor Hayes, 70 years old, widow of nearly a decade, mother to one daughter who used to braid my hair while I made soup. And that was the moment I knew I was no longer seen, just tolerated. The cake sat untouched until evening. I watched the sun stretch long over the porch steps, its light slowly falling away like everything else in my life. And then I sat at the dining table, folded the check I had written for her car payment last week, and tucked it back into my wallet. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. The pain didn't come in a scream, or a sob, or even a word. It came in the way I washed the cake tin, slowly and carefully. Like it mattered more than I did, I suppose. That's how this sort of thing always happens. Quietly, one moment, you're essential. Next, you're just furniture in someone else's house. I had given her everything. And suddenly, I was no longer worth the price of a plane ticket, or even a phone call that lasted more than 3 minutes. What pierced me that day wasn't just the absence, it was carelessness. The way she didn't even realize it was cruel. As though I were a fixture in her life she no longer needed to dust. The silence of that day echoed louder than any argument we'd ever had. Not that we argued much. I avoided conflict the way my late husband used to avoid dentists, smile, and say everything's fine, even when it isn't. But something cracked in me that day. Not a loud break, no, a hairline fracture, the kind that doesn't show until the wall finally falls down. I sat with that fracture for hours, not crying, just still, and by evening, I did the unthinkable. I started to wonder if I deserved more than crumbs from the people I had raised. The truth is, I'd always told myself she loved me in her own way, that I was lucky, that being needed, even a little, was something. But love, real love, doesn't make you feel like an obligation. That night, I sat in my bedroom, turned off the lamp, and let the dark settle around me like an old coat. And as I lay there, the words she once said, half joking, I thought, came back to me. You're just an old lady. Ma, you wouldn't understand. It was over a year ago. Something about her son's tablet breaking and me suggesting he read a book instead. Just an old lady, said with a laugh, a roll of the eyes, like it meant nothing. But it meant everything, because when someone tells you what they see, even in jest, you listen. She saw me as irrelevant, a relic, a woman who'd had her time and now needed to step aside. I used to think being a mother meant being available. Now I realized to her, it meant being invisible. I didn't sleep that night. I got up around 3 a.m., pulled on a cardigan, and sat in the kitchen with my old notebook. I made a list, not of chores, not groceries, a list of every time I had been made to feel small. I filled a full page before the birds began to stir. And for the first time in decades, I didn't feel like fixing it. I didn't feel like explaining, or justifying, or waiting for her to see me. I just wanted out, not out of life. I love my garden too much for that, but out of whatever cage I had let myself be kept in, the one lined with she means well and she's just busy, the one where I gave more than I received and smiled while doing it, I had no plan. Not yet, but something in me had shifted, that old sense of dignity, the one I'd left behind when I chose to overlook the little slights, had started to flicker back to life, and it told me this: you may be old, Eleanor, but you're not nothing. That's where this story begins, with a sponge cake, a silent house, and a truth I could no longer ignore. It wasn't the first time she'd made me feel forgotten, but it was the first time I let myself feel it all the way through. They say motherhood is the quiet stitching of invisible threads. Tiny seams that hold everyone else together while you yourself unravel in pieces no one sees. For me, those threads began when I was just 19, cradling a baby who looked nothing like me and everything like Hope. Amelia was born in the fall of 1974. With a full head of dark hair and a cry that curled around my ribs like a ribbon pulled tight, I was scared, yes, but I was also determined to be what no one had been for me. I didn't come from softness. My own mother believed discipline was the only language a child should learn. She didn't believe in birthday cakes or nighttime stories. So I made a vow the night I first held my daughter that I would make warmth a ritual, not a rarity. And I did. I gave her everything I had, even when there wasn't much. My husband, Arthur, worked on the railways, long shifts, rough hands, and quiet nights where he'd fall asleep in his armchair before the second commercial break. I ran a small daycare out of our home, watching other people's children while I raised my own. There was no glamour in it, just peanut butter sandwiches, scraped knees, and endless laundry. But I never minded. That house was full of little voices, and the kind of mess that meant life was happening. Amelia was the light in the middle of it all. I still remember the way she used to wrap her arms around my neck so tightly when I dropped her off at preschool, as if letting go for even a minute might break the world in two, on snow days. We'd build crooked snowmen in the yard, and I'd sneak chocolate chips into her oatmeal, little things, tiny pieces of love. When Arthur died in 2002, something in both of us broke. He'd been sick for a long time, and by the end, I was more of a caregiver than a wife. But grief doesn't care for titles. It chewed through us all the same. Amelia was 28 by then, newly married, already pregnant. She told me I needed to take care of myself now. That I'd done enough, but love doesn't retire. It just shifts shapes. I babysat my grandson, Henry, 5 days a week while she went back to work, changed diapers, sang lullabies, paced the hallway at midnight when he had colic. I was 60 years old with a bad hip and hands that ached in the cold, but I never said no. I baked his birthday cakes from scratch. I made sure the dog walked when she forgot. I stayed late when she had to work overtime, and I never once asked for anything in return, not because I was a saint, but because it felt like breathing. That's the thing no one tells you. Sometimes love doesn't feel like a gift, it feels like gravity. You do it because you must, because it keeps the whole world from tipping. When Amelia divorced in 2011, she moved back in with me for a year and a half. She had Henry, then 4 years old, and a fear in her eyes that reminded me of my own young face decades earlier. I let them take the master bedroom, even though it meant I had to move into the smaller room with the drafty window. I remember going to the hardware store to buy new curtains for them, blue ones, with tiny silver stars. She didn't thank me, but I didn't expect her to. That's the trap we build as mothers, giving without terms, hoping one day they'll just notice. They rarely do. Even after she remarried, I kept showing up. Every school event, every doctor's appointment. When Henry got pneumonia in 5th grade, I stayed with him for 4 straight nights so she wouldn't have to miss work. I remember sitting beside his bed, holding his hand while the humidifier rattled in the corner. He called me my guardian angel in his half-sleep. It made me cry in the dark, quietly, so no one would know. Over the years, I paid off 2 of her credit card bills when she got overwhelmed. I covered the down payment for her second home, the very one I now live in the guest house of. Back then, she said it would be our home, that I'd always have a place. I believed her, signed the deed jointly. She cried when I did it, kissed my forehead, and said, "You've always been my rock." I held onto those words like a pressed flower, fragile, faded, but proof that something beautiful had once existed. I don't say all this to paint myself as a martyr. I'm not. I had my flaws. I could be controlling. I know that I gave advice when no one asked. I hovered, but I never meant harm. Everything I did came from love. Not perfect love, but steadfast, unshakable love. The kind that shows up with groceries. The kind that folds laundry at midnight. The kind that stays when everyone else leaves. I never took vacations, never bought expensive things for myself. My shoes were always a year too old, my winter coat always just warm enough. But Amelia always had new clothes for work. Henry always had fresh notebooks, science kits, and braces when he needed them. I made sure of that. Sometimes I think back to the little sacrifices, the ones no one saw. The time I gave up knee surgery because Henry needed braces and there wasn't enough in the savings. The time I skipped my own birthday lunch because she needed a sitter last minute. I said yes. Every time, every single time. And now I'm the old woman who gets a text on her birthday while her family flies off to see fireworks and cartoon mice. What I gave them wasn't money or things, though there was plenty of that. What I gave them was time, the best of it, the years when my body still worked and my mind was still sharp. I gave them my prime, and somewhere along the way, that gift became an expectation, then a burden. Then in nothing. I used to believe love guaranteed remembrance, that kindness built something unshakable, but the truth is harder. People forget, especially the ones you gave most to. So when she said those words, "You're just an old lady," they weren't new. They were just the final echo of something I'd known deep down for a long time. She didn't see me anymore, not as her mother, not as a woman, not even as a person with value. And if she couldn't see me, then maybe it was time I stopped making myself visible. That's when I began to wonder what life could look like if I finally turned the light back on. Not for her, but for me. It never happens all at once. That's the lie people tell themselves, that there's a single moment when someone stops loving you, or seeing you, or needing you. But no, it's much slower than that. It's a soft erosion. Like sea wind on stone, you don't notice the damage until one day you run your hand along the surface and realize it's hollow where it used to be solid. The first time I noticed, it was something small. Amelia had hosted a birthday party for Henry. He was turning 11, I think, and she asked me to come early to help decorate. I brought over the streamers, the paper lanterns, even the cake. I had spent the night before piping tiny basketballs out of orange icing, because that year he was obsessed with the NBA. I arrived, arms full, heart full, but when I walked in, her friend Marla, a woman I'd met only twice, was already setting the table. Amelia looked up and smiled, but it wasn't for me. It was that polite kind of smile you give someone delivering a package. Just leave that on the counter. Ma, we've got it handled. We, as in her and Marla. I stood in the kitchen for a while, waiting to be needed. Nobody asked me to hang anything. No one looked at the cake when the guests arrived. I was introduced not as Mom or Nana, but as Eleanor, like I was an acquaintance. I ended up sitting on the back patio with a lukewarm cup of coffee, listening to the laughter spill out from the house I helped her buy. That's how it starts. The invitation that doesn't come, the seat that's no longer saved, the photo where you're cropped out. Other moments followed. They stacked like old mail on the counter. Easy to ignore at first, until the pile becomes something you trip over. She stopped calling me every Sunday. Then it became once a month. Then only when she needed something, I'd see a missed call from her and know, without checking, that it meant a favor. Can you pick up Henry? Can you water the plants while we're out of town? Never how are you, Ma, never do you need anything. The loneliness didn't arrive with sirens, it came in silence. Holidays became performances. I'd cook a full meal, set the table with linen napkins, and light the good candles. They'd arrive late, arms full of excuses and Tupperware containers filled with something healthier. Amelia would barely touch the roast, she'd glance at her phone during dinner. Henry would excuse himself to his room the moment dessert was served. They were physically present, yes, but emotionally somewhere else entirely. I tried, Lord knows I did. I read books she liked, so we'd have something to talk about. I learned how to use email just to send her updates. I'd compliment her hair even when I didn't recognize the color, but my efforts hung in the air, like smoke, noticed, maybe, but never breathed in. There was one morning I remember especially. I'd taken the train into the city to surprise her at work. I'd packed a lunch, nothing fancy, just turkey on rye, an apple, and 2 lemon cookies. She had told me once, offhandedly, that she missed my cookies, so I made them. I walked into the lobby of her building, heart racing like I was on a first date. I waited and waited. When she came down, her face was startled. Not delighted, not touched, just startled. "Ma, you didn't tell me you were coming." I handed her the bag. She took it without opening it. "Oh, thanks, I've got a meeting, though." And that was it. I watched her walk back toward the elevator, already unwrapping a protein bar. I stood there for a while, pretending to check my watch, pretending I had somewhere else to be. Then I threw the bag away in a bin beside the escalator. The cookies were still warm. That hurt more than any fight we'd ever had. But fights are honest, silence isn't. That's what I was living in, an unspoken exile, not dramatic enough to be noticed, just inconvenient enough to make me feel small. When I brought it up, gently, of course, she brushed it off. "You're too sensitive, Ma, I've just been busy. Don't take everything so personally." So I stopped bringing it up. Instead, I started carrying it alone. I started noticing how her tone changed when she talked to others, warmer, softer. I heard her speak to her neighbor's mother once, sweet, affectionate, calling her Mrs. R. I couldn't remember the last time she'd said my name. With that much light behind it, she started planning vacations without telling me. She began letting Henry stay with her new husband's parents during the holidays. When I asked if I could still have him for our annual summer week at the lake cabin, she hesitated. "We'll have to see, Ma, he's getting older now, getting older, as if that meant I was no longer necessary. And maybe I wasn't. That was the hardest pill to swallow, not the cruelty, but the indifference. I could have endured anger, even resentment, but this quiet fading, it felt like I was watching myself disappear in real time. I remember one evening sitting on the porch swing, listening to the wind whistle through the trees, and thinking, if I just stopped showing up, would anyone notice? Not in a dark, dramatic way, just in a quiet, curious one. I didn't want flowers. I didn't need applause. I just wanted to feel like I still mattered. But instead, I was becoming a ghost in my own life, and ghosts eventually stop knocking. It wasn't a single act that drove me to the edge. It was 100 quiet hurts, 1,000 small cuts. All those ordinary moments that no one sees, except the woman who goes home alone and remembers each one like a stone in her pocket by the time she said it. "You're just an old lady." I wasn't even surprised. I was just finally ready to believe her. I think the worst kind of betrayal is the kind that doesn't even feel like betrayal to the person doing it. It came one ordinary Tuesday, cool breeze, overcast sky, a mug of peppermint tea in my hands. I'd been in the guest house that morning, sorting through old photo albums I'd pulled down from the closet, Henry's baby pictures, Amelia's high school graduation, Arthur asleep in a lawn chair, a book resting on his chest, the usual ghosts that visit you when the present feels paper-thin. The doorbell rang at the main house just after noon. I watched from the window as a man in a blue jacket stepped onto the porch, clipboard in hand. Amelia greeted him with that sharp, transactional tone she uses when she's impatient, a few. Words were exchanged, and he handed her some paperwork. I didn't think much of it. That evening, I went up to the house to return a casserole dish. She was in the kitchen with her laptop open, eyes scanning the screen like it was a ticking bomb. Her new husband, Derek, sat across from her, sipping wine. They didn't notice me at first. "I just need you to sign here," she said, without looking up. "It's the refinancing paperwork." I paused. "Refinancing what?" "The house," she said, too casually. "We're rolling some things together. Lower interest rate. Just a technical thing. Doesn't change anything." She slid a single sheet toward me. A signature line near the bottom. My name is all ready. Typed above it, something in me stiffened. I've never been savvy with numbers, but I've learned to read tone, and hers was to practice, to smooth. "What exactly is this for?" I asked. Voice steady, careful. Derek gave a tight smile. "It's just paperwork, Eleanor. Nothing big." But the more I asked, the more vague their answers became. So I told her I wanted to read it properly. Alone, I took the document, walked back down to the guest house, and sat at the little table by the window. That's when I saw it, the clause. In small print, on the second page, buried beneath the jargon, was the removal of my name from the deed. My signature, once given, would relinquish all rights. The house, technically, would no longer be mine. My hand went cold around the teacup. I read it 3 times, just to be sure. Then I turned off the lamp and sat in the dim. So this was it. This was the final shift. Not forgetting. Not a distance. Not a birthday missed or a hug left hanging. This was deliberate. I didn't confront her. Not right away. Instead, I sat with it. I let it settle like silt in my chest. I thought of every moment that had led me to this chair, every dollar I had handed over without hesitation, every dinner I'd cooked. Every time I had looked the other way when her sharpness turned cruel, and still. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, that she didn't know what she was asking. Maybe Derek had filled out the forms and she hadn't looked, but deep down, I knew. The next morning, she came down to the guest house, holding a coffee cup like it was a peace offering. She didn't ask how I slept, didn't ask if I had questions. You don't need to overthink it more. It's just for efficiency. You'll still live here. Nothing's changing. Her words weren't rushed. They were smooth, rehearsed, the kind of smooth you use when you're trying to keep someone from noticing the blade at their back. I didn't respond. I just handed her the paper, unsigned. She blinked. "You didn't sign." "I read it," I said softly. There was a pause. A flicker of irritation passed through her face. Not guilt, irritation. Like I was the one making this difficult. "It's really not a big deal," she muttered. But it was, and we both knew it. Because what she wanted wasn't my signature. It was my silence, my compliance. She expected me to say yes, the way I always had. For years, I had been her safety net, the one who stayed behind, who kept things tidy, who paid without question. The one who never asked to be seen, only to be needed. And now she no longer needed me. She wanted the house I'd helped buy, the house I'd helped maintain, but not the complication of my name on the papers. She wanted the inheritance before the loss, the benefit without the bond. I stood there, feeling like a coat hung too long on a hook by the door. Useful once, on the way now. She left without another word, no apology, no explanation, just the right click of the door behind her. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pen. I made a list, again, but this time, it wasn't a list of hurts. It was a list of steps, the name of a lawyer an old friend had recommended years ago, still scribbled in the back of my address book. The contents of my savings account, the Insurance policy I had nearly forgotten I still paid into. I was calm, almost clinical. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake. I just kept writing. And at the bottom of the list, one line, "I am not just an old lady." I read it aloud, quietly, like a vow. For so long, I had lived in the shadow of usefulness, measuring my worth by how many favors I could still offer. But now the final line has been crossed. Not because of the deed, but because of the ease with which they tried to erase me. It wasn't a mistake, it was a decision, and that changed everything. I didn't speak of it again, not to Amelia, not to Derek, not even to the neighbor who sometimes brought me newspaper clippings and homemade marmalade. I let the silence take up space between us, not as punishment, but as preservation. Because silence, I realized, is its own kind of answer, and sometimes it's the only one people can hear. For nearly a week, I kept my routine the same: morning tea by the window, feeding the garden cats who wandered into the yard like clockwork. I watered the peonies, I clipped dead branches from the lemon tree. I made myself small again, but not out of habit. This time, it was strategic. I needed space to think. I stopped walking up to the main house. I didn't return her casserole dish. I didn't call to check on Henry's midterms. I didn't ask if they needed anything from the store. I just became absent, and in my absence, I started gathering pieces of myself. The first thing I did was find the folder. It was tucked inside an old filing cabinet under years of taxes and warranties and appliance manuals. Inside were the original documents from the house, the deed with both our names printed neatly side by side, the mortgage terms, the handwritten note Amelia had given me when we bought it. "Thank you for believing in me. Always, I'll never forget what you've done." I ran my fingers across the ink. It was smudged slightly at the bottom, a drop of something, maybe wine, maybe water. I folded it back inside and placed the folder on the kitchen table like it had become sacred. The next day, I called the lawyer. Her name was Miriam, and she had a voice like chamomile tea. Calm, unhurried, I told her what had happened, not in anger, not in grief, but with the detachment of someone reporting weather patterns. She asked for documents. I scanned them. She asked if I felt coerced. I told her I hadn't signed anything. "That's good," she said. "You still have rights. Let's talk through options." We met in person a few days later. Her office was on the second floor of a converted craftsman bungalow. The walls were lined with books and botanical prints. She offered me tea, the good kind, loose leaf, in a ceramic mug. She listened. I told her everything. Not just about the deed, but the years that came before it, the slow erosion, the missed birthdays, the party where no one looked at the cake I'd baked. She didn't take notes at first. She just nodded. When I finished, she leaned forward and said, "You don't sound angry. You sound done." She was right. I wasn't angry. I was emptied out, and what remained was something steadier than rage, resolve. We talked through scenarios. Legal protection, estate adjustments, the structure of joint ownership. I didn't pretend to understand all the terms, but I listened. I asked questions. I wrote things down. I began moving differently. In the weeks that followed, I opened a new bank account, just in my name. I transferred my savings. I updated the beneficiary on my life insurance policy. I went through my belongings with fresh eyes, sorting what mattered and what didn't. I started walking in the mornings again, not the slow, dutiful strolls to the post box, but real walks. Miles down side streets, past places I hadn't noticed in years. I found a bench near the rose garden in town and made it mine. I bought myself a small thermos and filled it with green tea. I sat there breathing, watching people pass. No one knew where I was, and I liked it that way. Amelia didn't notice the silence right away, or if she did, she didn't care. Maybe she thought I was sulking. Maybe she thought I'd come around like I always did. I didn't. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. One evening, I heard a knock at the guest house door. I didn't answer. I sat still, book in hand, heart steady. The knock came again, then footsteps faded. I turned the page. It felt strange, at first, this absence of obligation. For so long, I had defined myself by what I gave: meals, favors, money, time. Without the giving, who was I? It turns out, I was still someone. Someone who liked old French films and lavender soap. Someone who had kept every birthday card Arthur had ever written. Someone who hummed while folding towels. Someone who had thoughts no one else had access to. I started journaling again. Nothing grand, just lines in a notebook, lists of things I remembered. My mother's hands, the smell of rain on cement. The way Amelia used to sleep with one hand curled under her cheek, and slowly I started writing other things that had nothing to do with family, a recipe I made up. A memory from a trip I took before marriage, a description of the sky. When the clouds turned pink and gold. I was rebuilding something, quietly, carefully. The silence didn't feel like loneliness anymore. It felt like a room to breathe, to think, to choose. By the 4th week, Miriam had filed the necessary documents to reassert my legal claim to the property. Nothing flashy, just enough to ensure I couldn't be pushed out or signed away. I didn't want revenge. I wanted security. I wanted peace. Amelia hadn't tried again. No calls, no texts, not even Henry came by. And that, too, stopped stinging. It just was. I had stopped expecting them to notice my absence, because I had finally started noticing my presence. One morning, I sat on the steps outside with a mug of chamomile tea, the same kind Miriam had served me. The air smelled like rosemary and old pine. A neighbor's wind chimes clinked softly in the breeze. I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for an apology, not for validation, not for a knock on the door. My silence wasn't punishment, it was protection, and it was the first thing I'd given to myself in a very long time. There's a certain shift that happens inside you when you stop needing to be chosen. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel like triumph or victory. It feels like exhaling after holding your breath for far too long. In the quiet weeks that followed, I began doing things differently, not to make a point, but because the version of myself I had been clinging to no longer fit. I had spent so many years curled around other people's needs that I'd forgotten what it meant to stand upright in my own life. It started with something small. I stopped asking permission. There was an art fair in town the first weekend of May, something I usually skipped because Amelia always had plans and I didn't want to go alone. But this time I went. I wore a soft blue scarf Arthur once bought me at a church fundraiser. The one I used to save for holidays. I walked slowly past the stalls, breathing in the smell of sawdust and oil paint, touching woven baskets and handmade soaps like they were relics from a better life. At one booth, a woman was selling pressed flowers inside glass pendants. I picked up one with a single wild violet. She smiled and said, "It's for someone who's learning how to bloom again." I didn't ask what she meant. I just paid for it and wore it home. A few days later, I did something else I never used to do. I said no. Amelia had finally texted me. Short, terse, "Can you pick up Henry from practice on Friday?" I stared at the screen for a long time, not out of indecision, but because I realized how automatic my yes had always been. My replies had always come from muscle memory, not desire. This time, I typed, "I won't be available. Hope it works out." I didn't explain. I didn't soften it. I just let the sentence stand as it was, and then I turned my phone face down and made myself a cup of cinnamon tea. That small act, that simple boundary, felt like lighting a candle in a cave. The glow was faint, but real. From there, I kept going. I took the guest bedroom and made it mine. I took down the beige curtains Amelia had picked out and replaced them with gauzy floral ones I found at a second-hand shop. I put the quilt my mother had stitched, the only soft thing she ever gave me, back on the bed. I moved the armchair to face the window where the morning sun spilled in. I made the space feel like it belonged to someone with a name, not just a function. I began visiting the library again, not for Henry. For me, I checked out old cookbooks, mystery novels, and a memoir by a woman who travelled alone through Norway in her 60s. I lingered there longer than I needed to, letting the hush wrap around me like a bomb. One afternoon, I bumped into someone I hadn't seen in years, Miriam, not the lawyer, but the woman who used to teach ceramics at the community centre. Her hair was white now, and she wore bold jewellery, the kind that clinked when she moved. "Eleanor," she said, beaming. "It's been too long." We talked like no time had passed. She invited me to a small gathering of women who met every Thursday evening to talk and make things with their hands, clay, fabric, found objects. I said yes. That first Thursday, I sat at a long wooden table surrounded by women with laugh lines and loose cardigans, the room filled with the scent of coffee and lavender lotion. I didn't say much at first. Just watched, listened, but by the end, I was molding a tiny bowl between my palms, the clay cool and pliable. When I brought it home, I placed it on my windowsill, not because it was beautiful, it was lopsided and cracked, but because it was proof I had made something just for me. Meanwhile, Miriam the lawyer had finished processing the documents. My ownership rights were legally reaffirmed. A letter had been sent to Amelia and Derek, formally reminding them of my standing. I never heard back. No apology, no confrontation. But something shifted in the air after that. They began keeping their distance. No more knocks at the door. No more unannounced visits. It was like they'd quietly accepted that I was no longer their fallback plan I'd expected to feel. Some hollow ache when that moment came, but instead I felt relief. The weight of obligation, the constant emotional vigilance, was gone. And in its place was space, not freedom in the big, cinematic sense. I wasn't off travelling the world or dancing in the moonlight, but freedom in small ways, drinking coffee slowly, saying no without guilt, owning my time. I began putting money aside, not for anyone else, just for me. I opened a separate savings account with a modest amount and labelled it Quiet Joy. I didn't know yet what I'd use it for. A trip, maybe, or a workshop, or maybe just fresh linens and a better mattress. One evening, as I sat on the porch reading by lantern light, the wind picked up and knocked over a potted fern. I started to reach for my phone, instinctively thinking I'd call Amelia, until I realized I didn't need to. I could handle it. I always had. I picked up the pot, swept the spilled soil into a pan, and repotted it. My hands still steady, my back still strong enough. I whispered, "Still here," not to anyone in particular, just to the sky. That became my quiet mantra in the days that followed. Still here. Still whole, still learning how to choose myself, even after a lifetime of being chosen last. The days began to soften, not because anything changed outside, but because I had changed inside. I stopped hoping for someone to come and make it better. I became the person who held the broom and the glue and the thread. It didn't make the loss disappear, but it made it matter differently. I was moving differently now, not with urgency or bitterness, but with clarity. Each step forward felt less like escape and more like rival. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking in anyone else's shadow. It was subtle at first, the way their lives began to shift after I stepped back. You don't always notice when you're holding up the beams of a house until you stop, and then the creaking begins. The tiny cracks, the sense that something foundational isn't quite right. They didn't say anything outright. There were no frantic calls, no knocking at my door in the rain. But small signs began to show. The porch light at the main house, the one I used to change every spring, stayed burnt out for weeks. The hedges grew wild and heavy over the walkway. The trash bins, once wheeled out every Thursday morning like clockwork, were now sometimes left overflowing by the curb. Those things didn't used to happen, because I used to take care of them. It hadn't seemed like much at the time, just little errands, quiet touches. But they were the glue, the invisible maintenance of a life running smoothly, and when I stopped showing up, so did those things. At first, I thought maybe it would be temporary, that Amelia would eventually knock, not to argue or explain, but simply to say, "I didn't realize how much you did," but she didn't, and that, too, told me something. She had either convinced herself she didn't need me, or she was too proud to admit that maybe she had. Still, I could see the strain. There was a Sunday morning when I sat in my garden trimming the rosemary bush, and I saw Henry trudging toward the car with an armful of laundry and a sour expression. The trunk was already open, stuffed with black trash bags and unfolded clothes. Amelia was leaning against the driver's side, phone in hand, face drawn. I didn't wave, I just watched. Later that week, I overheard her in the driveway arguing with Derek. The tone wasn't loud, but clipped, brittle. "I told you, I don't have time to deal with it. My mother used to do it. Just let it go, that was all I caught." But it stayed with me. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because it reminded me that my role had always been more than what they were willing to say aloud. I had been the quiet current that made their days easier. The one who stocked the pantry when things ran low, the one who kept track of birthdays and prescriptions and school projects, the one who showed up without needing to be asked, over and over again. Now, my absence hung in the air like a missing note in a familiar song. They were still playing the melody, but it didn't sound right anymore. I heard from Miriam, the lawyer, that Amelia had reached out to request new documents regarding the house. She was looking into options, was how the assistant phrased it. But there wasn't much to be done. I still had full legal standing. The attempt to remove me had failed, quietly and completely, and yet she never came to speak to me about it, not even a half-hearted apology. That silence, like so many others, spoke volumes. In the meantime, something unexpected began to happen. People I hadn't heard from in years began reappearing. Miriam from Ceramics introduced me to a woman named Joyce, who ran a small book club out of her den. We read fiction and poetry and sometimes just drank tea and watched old movies. I began volunteering once a week at the Historical Society, sorting photos and letters in the archive room. My hands, which had once packed lunches and folded linens, now turned pages delicately and recorded dates in pencil. There was a quiet joy in it, preserving things that mattered. Even if no one else remembered them, my world, once centered entirely on Amelia and Henry, began to widen, not in some grand, cinematic way, but slowly, like curtains being pulled open an inch at a time, and as it widened, I began to see what they had lost by pushing me away. Not my money, though I had stopped contributing to any of their expenses, not my presence, though I no longer attended birthdays or holidays. What they had lost was the constant, soft presence of someone who loved them without condition. It had once been so easy for Amelia to count on me, to expect me to say yes, to take for granted that I would remember, I would clean, I would cover. For her, now, she was remembering what it meant to live without that cushion. I received a card in the mailbox one day, not from her, but from Henry. It was a folded piece of printer paper with his handwriting, messy and uncertain. He said he missed my lasagna. Those things were weird at home, that he hoped I was okay. I didn't respond right away. I let the note sit on my dresser for a week before I took out a card of my own. No return address, Just a line of soft encouragement. I'm always here when you need kindness. That's never changed. No guilt, no pleading, just the truth. Because that's what I had begun to understand. I didn't have to stop loving them. But I could stop offering that love as a lifeline they never asked for and didn't know how to hold. In small ways, they began to feel my absence, and in small ways, I began to understand my own value, not because I was needed, but because I existed. I wasn't waiting for a grand reconciliation. I wasn't fantasizing about regret or revelation. I had lived too long to expect neat endings. But I had also lived long enough to recognize when someone's life shifts in your absence. Sometimes the only way they realize what you gave them is when they're forced to go without it. I never wanted them to suffer, but I did want them to see. And whether or not they ever truly did, I had started seeing myself, not as just an old lady, but as someone who had always been worth more than they ever said out loud. And now I was finally saying it to myself. It had been nearly 3 months since I'd last spoken to Amelia. By then, the seasons had started to shift, spring softening into summer. The kind of days where the light lingers just a little longer on the kitchen floor, and you begin to feel the heat in the handle of your teacup. I had grown comfortable in the silence, not bitter, not numb, just still, like a field left fallow on purpose, resting after too many years of being tilled without mercy. One morning, I woke up early, not because of any noise, but because a thought had taken root in my chest, and it wouldn't let go. I needed to write, not for her, for me, for the version of myself who had kept quiet for too long. The woman who had smiled through every dismissal, who had nodded through every insult disguised as a joke. The one who had stayed at the edge of her own life, waiting to be invited in, so I made a cup of tea, opened the window to let the breeze in, and took out a sheet of heavy cream stationery I'd been saving for something that mattered. I held the pen in my hand for a while before writing the first word. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Dear Eleanor, I began, I know you've been waiting a long time for someone to say thank you. For someone to notice, to choose you, without needing anything in return. I'm sorry it took this long for someone to do that. I'm sorry it has to be you. My hand trembled a little as I wrote, not from age, but from the weight of everything I had never said. I wrote about the nights I stayed up rocking Amelia. Through fevers, the meals I skipped to make sure there was enough on the table for everyone else, the birthdays I planned, the arguments I smoothed over, the hurts I buried in the soft soil of motherhood. I wrote about Arthur, how he used to hold my hand under the table when Amelia rolled her eyes, how he told me, quietly once, you keep this whole house standing, Elle, they just don't see it. I wrote about the things I never dared speak aloud, like the moment I realized I was no longer her sanctuary, but her safety net, something to fall back on, not to return to. And then I wrote this, you were never just an old lady, you were the memory keeper, the peace broker, the quiet architect of a life full of meaning. Even when no one clapped for you, even when your name was left off the invitation, or the credit, or the deed, the letter went on for 5 pages, no bitterness, just the truth, soft, steady, unwavering. When I finished, I didn't fold it. I laid it on the table and read it back to myself in a whisper, line by line. Like a prayer for the parts of me that had never heard kindness in my own voice before, then I lit a match, not out of anger, but the ceremony. I burned the letter in a shallow dish on the porch, watching the edges curl and vanish into grey. The breeze carried the ash toward the rose bush, the one Amelia and I had planted the year she turned 10. It felt like something sacred, like leaving flowers at the foot of a grave. Later that evening, I found an envelope wedged in the doorframe of the guest house, Amelia's handwriting, slanted, rushed. I stared at it for a while before opening. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, no salutation, no apology. Just for sentences. I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought I was doing what made sense. You've always done so much for us. I hope we can find a way back. There was no signature. I didn't cry. I just placed the letter next to the small clay bowl I'd made at the Thursday group. Let it sit there, let it be seen. I didn't respond, not because I was finished, but because I was beginning. That letter, the one I wrote to myself, was the real turning point. It wasn't about them, not really. It was about reclaiming something I didn't even realize I'd given away, my voice, my name. My own witness to the life I had lived. Sometimes the most powerful forgiveness is the one you offer yourself. For staying too long, for giving too much, for waiting on people who were never going to say what you needed to hear, and once that forgiveness settles, something else begins to bloom. You stop asking to be invited in, you start building the home inside yourself, a place where your memory is preserved not by others, but by you. I placed a fresh sheet of stationery on the desk the next morning, not to write another letter, but just in case. In case a new thought came, in case I needed to remind myself again, because healing doesn't happen all at once, it happens in circles, in revisits. In soft reminders that you are no longer who you were, but you still carry her gently inside. And from now on, I will carry her with care. The days began to pass like warm water through my hands, quiet, gentle, without demand. I started waking up without an alarm, not from restlessness, but from peace. There was a certain rhythm to my mornings now. I'd put on the kettle, wrap my shawl around my shoulders, and sit by the window as the sun rose behind the pear tree. The light slowly slipping across the wooden floor. The world didn't ask anything of me. It just offered itself, birdsong, breeze, and the soft hush of a new day. I had stopped expecting anything grand to arrive. No reckoning, no apology, no cinematic reunion with tears and clasped hands. Life didn't work like that, I'd learned, and that was okay. Amelia never followed up on the note she left in my doorway. Perhaps she thought that was enough. Perhaps she didn't know what else to say. Or perhaps she knew that the silence that followed wasn't anger anymore. It was a boundary. I didn't reach out, either, not from pride, but from peace. The kind of peace that comes when you no longer have to explain yourself. Henry wrote me another letter a week later, this time in pencil, with fewer spelling mistakes. He said he wanted to come over and sit with me like before. He missed the way the house smelled when I baked bread. He said no one baked anymore. Everyone just bought things in plastic bags. I smiled at that. There was something honest in it, something unformed and unfiltered. I wrote back and told him he was welcome, always no sides to pick, no conditions to meet, and a few days later he showed up, taller than I remembered, his voice cracking slightly at the edges. But his eyes still soft. We didn't talk much. I made him cinnamon toast, and he sat at the table picking at the crust like he used to when he was 6. It felt ordinary, which is what made it beautiful. He didn't ask why I hadn't come around. He didn't mention Amelia or Derek. He just sat beside me in the sun, eating toast, and told me about a science project involving frogs. I nodded, asked questions. Laughed once when he said his partner fainted during dissection, and when he left, I didn't cry. I just stood at the door and waved, then went back to my garden. My roses had started blooming again, red, yellow, and one stubborn white one that never bloomed until midsummer. I trimmed the edges, humming quietly. Then sat with my hands in the dirt for a while. It reminded me that something always returns, if given time and silence. Later that evening, I sat down at the small round table where I now ate most of my meals. Alone, yes, but not lonely. I'd set a plate for myself, a linen napkin, even a candle. Not because anyone was watching, but because I was. and I had learned, slowly, that I was still worth setting a table for. In the corner of the room was a basket with yarn and knitting needles. I hadn't touched them in years, but I picked them up and started again, clumsy at first, then steadier. It wasn't for anyone else this time. No booties for babies, no scarves for birthdays. Just a pattern I liked, a softness in my lap. My life was not dramatic. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic confrontations or triumphant speeches, just the quiet, accumulating dignity of someone who had decided to live on their own terms. And in that quiet, I started to understand something deeper. My value had never been in what I gave away. It had been in the love that lived inside me, the loyalty, the gentleness, the steadiness. Even when it was overlooked, even when it was mistaken for weakness. Amelia had called me just an old lady, but I was a woman who had rebuilt her life with bare hands and boundary silence. A woman who had kept faith with herself when no one else thought to, and now I was free, not because anything around me had changed, but because I still remembered the hurt, I still remembered the sharp edge of her words, but they didn't define me anymore. They were just one line in a much longer story. There was still laundry to do, dishes to wash, meals to prepare. But now I moved through those tasks like small rituals, not obligations, each movement a kind of devotion, not to them, but to myself. My home had grown quieter, but it was full of warmth, full of care, full of small, unnoticed joys that I had once given to others and had now, finally, given back to myself, sometimes in the late evening. I'd light a single candle and write in my journal by hand, something I hadn't done in years. I didn't write for anyone else to read, just for the soft echo of my own thoughts, returning home. And in one entry, I wrote this: I wasn't angry, I was finally empty, and that was beautiful. Because when you spend your life pouring into everyone else's cup, you forget what it means to be whole, to sit with yourself and realize there's nothing missing, nothing more to prove, nothing left to earn. My life is quiet now, and that is enough. One morning, just as summer began pressing its golden weight into the air, I stepped outside and realized I'd outgrown the life I'd been surviving in. Not just the version they'd left me with, but even the version I had gently rebuilt. The garden was blooming in every direction, marigolds unfolding like tiny sunbursts, bees humming with tireless grace, and the old pear tree finally bearing fruit again after 3 quiet years. I stood there barefoot in the grass, mug of tea cooling in my hand, and I felt something shift. A fullness I couldn't name, not happiness exactly, not pride, something quieter, wiser, peace, maybe. I had spent the last few months learning how to live without apology, and now I was ready to live with intention. That day, I did something small, something no one else would have noticed. I went into the guest house and opened the drawer where I kept old insurance papers and bank statements. I pulled out a folder I'd started months ago and finished what I'd been quietly planning. A new will. It was written with care. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but clarity. Everything I owned, the savings, the portion of the property I still held, my grandmother's locket. The small paintings Arthur and I had collected over the years was going to be given to people who had shown me something rare and real. Henry was among them. I'd left him a letter, too, separate from the legal packet. In it, I told him about the day he was born, how I had held him for the first time while Amelia was still asleep in the hospital bed, how he'd gripped my finger with surprising strength. I wrote about the night I stayed up with him through a stomach bug, and the time we sat together building model rockets while the house was too quiet. I told him that kindness and curiosity were the only inheritance that really mattered, and that he all. Edie had both. The rest I divided between the women I'd come to know at the Thursday Craft Circle and the Historical Society, where I'd spent so many peaceful hours archiving the lives of strangers. I left a small amount for the local library with a note. Use it to repair the windows and buy large print books, and maybe more poetry. I signed the documents with a steady hand. Not because I was planning to leave anytime soon, but because I finally understood that this, too, was a way of choosing myself, of saying I mattered, I was here, and I want the end of my story to be written in my own ink. Later that week, I received a call, not from Amelia, from her husband, Derek. His voice was clipped. Polite in that way people are when they want to avoid saying too much. I wanted to ask, he said, if you'd be willing to talk. Amelia's been struggling. I didn't ask what. I didn't owe that curiosity anymore, but I said I'd think about it. I hung up the phone and sat in the armchair by the window where the light poured in like honey over the pages of a book I wasn't reading. I didn't feel anxious or hopeful. I felt rooted, steady, like a tree that no longer needed to bend for anyone. That night, I wrote another letter, not to myself, not to Henry, to Amelia. I didn't write about blame or disappointment, or the moment she asked me to give up my name on the deed. I wrote about her as a child, how she used to sit at the kitchen table with purple-stained fingers from blackberries, building towers from sugar packets, how she'd ask me to braid her hair tight enough that it wouldn't come loose during gym class. I told her that love had never left this house. It had just changed shape. I didn't say, you hurt me. I wrote, I learned. I didn't say, you don't deserve me. I wrote, I deserve peace. I sealed the letter in a pale blue envelope and placed it in the small mailbox that sat halfway between the estate house and the main house. I didn't ring the bell. I didn't wait for a response, because I no longer needed one. Some letters aren't meant to begin a conversation. They're meant to end a pattern. The next day, I picked 3 ripe pears from the tree and made a crumble. I brought it to the Thursday group, wrapped in a tea towel. We ate it warm with tiny spoons, and someone brought a thermos of sweet milky chai. We laughed that day, not loud, raucous laughter, but the kind that comes from deep in the chest. The kind that says, I see you, and I'm glad you're here. Later, I sat on the garden bench and watched the sun sink into the horizon, the sky bruised with pink and lavender. I thought about all the women I'd become, the girl who never felt safe, the young mother who worked until her back arched, the wife who kept a family stitched together with kindness and lists and casseroles, the woman who was told she was just old, and the one who chose to believe otherwise, not out of defiance, but out of reverence. My life, as it stands now, is not flashy. It will never make headlines or fill photo albums, but it is mine, entirely mine. I water the roses. I write letters that no one may read. I sit at my own table. I make small decisions with great care. That is the gift I gave to myself, not a second act, but a true one. One that doesn't need applause, only stillness, only grace, and a life that, at last, fits the shape of my own heart.